Hello everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a sequel to my history video about Ishmael from 2 years ago. I'll leave a link to the original in the description. Since the release of the first video, a few drastic changes have happened, and I've received a request to make a follow-up video. It is time to answer the question, how different are things now and is Ishmael great again? Before the start of the video, I would like to address an interesting point raised by someone else that supposedly one of the biggest reasons why Ishmael lost popularity is because of the release of Celeste on the 18th of July 2018. This isn't really true. While it is true that she had a favorable matchup against Ishmael and somewhat contributed to his ultimate decline, she wasn't enough to curb his dominance in battles. If I had to list all of the heroes with a favorable matchup against Ishmael, I would also be obligated to include Astrid and Lucas, who was released with Goal City later that same year. Astrid and Lucas for Ishmael was a much more difficult match than Celeste, because Astrid and Lucas was practically a devoted counter to Ishmael, whereas Celeste was more generally a counter to the ancient vampirism mater. This is implied in her introduction video where she is shown obliterating Dorian, who was considered the best healer and the only competent healer at the time. Ishmael on his own had severe difficulties killing Lucas in beast form due to the fixed hit points of Lucas and being unable to deal actual damage to him, depriving him of the very valuable recovery in vampirism. This usually resulted in gradual gaining control of the tide of the battle for the enemy and their ultimate victory. Astrid and Lucas weren't unpopular either. On the contrary, many whales instantly jumped on the Astrid and Lucas hype train out of the gate, because so many people relied on Ishmael and therefore they saw great potential in Astrid and Lucas. Despite all this, why aren't either Celeste or Astrid and Lucas considered main reasons of Ishmael's decline? Well, for one, despite both of them being incredibly popular at the time, not every team had Celeste and Astrid and Lucas. Dorian was more established as a team healer due to vampirism meta being tried and true than Celeste. It took a while before she truly took off. Astrid and Lucas likewise was a novelty that not every team had. Heavy armored tanks, on the other hand, were everywhere and Ishmael teams always had to deal with that threat if they wanted Ishmael to succeed in battle. Most importantly though, Celeste and Astrid and Lucas were individual heroes that had very exploitable weaknesses. Celeste, for example, was a very squishy healer and control hero at the time. And Cornelius was a highly popular hero at the time due to twins rampaging through the battlefields. One monolith was all it took to obliterate Celeste, and he also provided Ishmael with magic defense boosts, which would diminish Celeste's heal block effects. As for Astrid and Lucas, she is a very one-dimensional hero. She is very effective against heroes that perform one single heavy attack to the front line at a time, but performs extremely poorly against heroes that inflict damage extremely quickly, or who also inflict damage over time debuffs such as burns and poisons. Understandably, she is also completely useless against AoE heroes, heroes that target multiple heroes, or backrank assassins such as Ju and Jorgen with his leper. Her very awkward style of combat also makes it very difficult to rotate a unique armor weapon artifact, so she is generally lacking as a protection hero unless she can consistently summon Lucas in battles, but if that's the case, it brings into question if she's the right member for the team when Lucas keeps getting beaten that much and not protecting her team in return. Unfortunately for Astrid and Lucas, her niche is way too specific. Most heroes have a way of bypassing Lucas's protection and make him obsolete as a defensive force. Ishmael teams typically deploy Qingmao to easily defeat Astrid and Lucas, due to her ultimate skill completely annihilating Lucas and providing the most coveted armor penetration weapon artifact, which Ishmael desperately needed to stay relevant during the rough times. Another simple option was bringing Ju with Ishmael, since Ju would just mop the floor with Astrid and perform a two-pronged attack on the enemy team with Ishmael focusing the front and Ju focusing the back. Jorgen was also useful in that endeavor due to leper. Wales also had the opportunity to dismantle Lucas with Cleaver due to his putrefaction acting as a damage over time skill that hits extremely quickly. I would also argue that Nexters unintentionally supported this counter-offensive against Astrid and Lucas by releasing their Goal City enemy guide on the 17th of October in 2018, as Astrid and Lucas works very similarly to sentry golems, and in the video, they show how to deal with sentry golems easily. Astrid is the princess of Gerwal City, and the daughter of King Cornac, who rules over the Drama Nation. This connection is no coincidence. I'll leave the link to the guide in the description. Naturally, the list of counterplays is long and goes on and on, but I believe I've made my point and it's unnecessary to talk about this further. These reasons are why Celeste and Astrid and Lucas are not considered the biggest reasons for Ishmael's downfall, but rather just contributing factors. Anyways, I'm sorry about this minor divergence. It's time to get back on the main topic. The first thing that happened since the release of the first video is the addition of spring skins on the 5th of March 2021. This matters, because it paved way for 5th total skins in the game, as both Ziri and Arachne were the first recipients of said 5th skins. This revived the hope for Ishmael's redemption, because now there was again a chance he might finally get his much coveted armor penetration increase, as unlikely as it seemed. And indeed, on the 24th of June 2021, that wish came true. Ishmael received a brand new solar skin, which increased his armor penetration stat. Ishmael's mediocre 24,430 armor penetration stat went up to a very respectable 35,080. This unprecedented buff restored the former relationship between Ishmael's damage and the damage reduction of his most difficult enemies. Most notably, it actually allowed him to deal full damage to Asterith, allowing him to utterly annihilate him again, which had not been possible since his barbarian skin that was released on the 22nd of February in 2018. I showed a glimpse of that in my Isaac's Magic Defense video, link will be in the description. Before we get ahead of ourselves though, it's important to mention that Ishmael was not out of the woods with just this adjustment. While it is true that the armor penetration skin is immensely helpful, Ishmael still wasn't quite proficient in killing the heavier tanks, and his very linear style of combat was full of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that prevented him from being a dominant force again. Another important detail is that Ziri received a health skin back in March of 2021, and would eventually be followed by Asterith and Luther in that same year. The inclusion of these skins would further soften the impact of the newly strengthened Ishmael, especially when pet patronages came into play, and this is not counting all of the other supportive skins for tanks released before my very first video, such as Luther's cybernetic skin from 7th of May in 2020 which boosts his health. At the very least though, Ishmael had once again become usable even if he was somewhat lacking. The only way he would be able to break the status quo is with a serious rework, which frankly sounded unlikely at the time due to Ishmael's high use rate on the old Facebook servers. On the 8th of November in 2021, a huge content update dropped. Next is released the guild raid update, which paved way to more stats for everyone. For the sake of brevity, I will not delve into the details of the mode itself, I will only include the relevant stat increases. Ishmael's maximum armor penetration value in total increased by 11,730. In comparison, the maximum armor value for individual heavy armored tanks increased in range of 13,088 to 14,448. The only tanks that got less armor than the aforementioned values were Aurora, who is a specialized dodge tank, and Rufus, who is a specialized magic tank. This unfortunate stat distribution increased the gap between Ishmael's armor penetration and most tanks' armor values yet again, with the exception of Corvus, who to this day is missing an armor skin. Most notably, Ishmael has once more lost the ability to deal full damage to Asterith, which is probably the most significant consequence of this. Although the gaps were nowhere near as bad as before the armor penetration skin on Ishmael, it felt as if we were approaching the end of Ishmael's viability yet again. After all, what incentive was there to building a damage dealer with very basic fighting style if he couldn't even get past tanks in time? His strong PvE capabilities were obsoleted by various content nerfs and power creep from Nexters, which allowed even free-to-play players to get by without ever having to touch Ishmael. Once more, Ishmael desperately needed help to become great again. When all hope was seemingly lost, a miracle occurred. It's as if the god of hero wars, also referred to as the creator, smiled on Ishmael and granted him strength once more. On the 15th of September 2022, Ishmael was reworked. Every single skill has improved in some way or the other, and he also received the novel Ascended skill upgrades in Asgard. His ultimate skill has been practically restored to its pre-nerf state. It was originally a 200% attack and skill speed increase before being nerfed to 150%, and now it's back at 200% again. As a small bonus, the ultimate skill retained its critical hit buff from the original balance change, making the current iteration the strongest it's ever been. His green skill has been buffed massively. Its duration has been doubled and now features a bonus energy mechanic for every attack that missed Ishmael, similar to the dodge stat and Heidi's spike ammo skill. It also retained its original base cooldown of 20 seconds. This skill is now immensely useful, because the bonus energy allows Ishmael to maintain his ultimate skill for longer, and the skill speed increase on his ultimate skill allows Ishmael to have nearly 100% uptime on the green skill, making him completely impervious to physical attacks. On the negative side of things, it created a weakness to Satori, who preys on bonus energy mechanics, but more on that later. This change also came with a name change, which in my opinion was pointless, and the new name is less cool. Mirage is better than Phantom, you can't change my mind. His blue skill received a slight buff. The maximum vampirism received a 10% increase, going from 65% to 75%. This isn't quite on par with the pre-nerf value of 125%, or 135% if adjusted for level 130 cap, but nonetheless it's a very useful boost and it shouldn't be underestimated. His violet skill has also been buffed. Instead of stunning an opponent on every 4th hit for 1 second, Ishmael can now do so on every 3rd hit. This skill is frankly still a bit questionable. It used to be the weakest skill in Ishmael's kit and only situationally useful. At the very least though, it has a very real purpose now due to the release of Fafnir, who helps making random stuns useful for physical attackers. As far as these improvements go, they're quite potent, but it gets out of this world only with ascended skills. His tier 2 ascended skill upgrade is Elusive Phantom, which as the name implies upgrades his green skill. When Elusive Phantom is unlocked, Ishmael's Phantom skill will extend its protection to magic attacks in addition to physical attacks. Remember how I mentioned Satori earlier? When Elusive Phantom is unlocked, Satori's ability to counter Ishmael becomes questionable, as he can no longer harm Ishmael when Phantom is active, and on the contrary only charges Ishmael further and allows him to stay in his ultimate skill longer. The hunter becomes the hunted, as they say. This skill upgrade also allows Ishmael to deal with his former nemesis Helios extremely well, as it makes Helios a complete non-threat. A complete game changer of an upgrade. There's not much else to say. And finally, his tier 5 ascended skill upgrade is Brutal Awakening, which, just like every other tier 5 ascended skill upgrade, improves Ishmael's ultimate skill. With this upgrade, whenever Ishmael uses his ultimate skill, his critical hits will deal 4 times more damage rather than the usual 2 times in addition to the other benefits. This skill upgrade is really what puts Ishmael back on his feet, because 4 times damage multiplier with critical hits allows Ishmael to have the fastest single target burst damage in the entire game. It allows Ishmael to seriously threaten tanks, despite the gap in armor and armor penetration, and bulldoze over the entire enemy team with ease. Additionally, the increased critical damage multiplier makes Ishmael a good counter to Axel, as Axel redistribution doesn't take into account critical hits and therefore cannot redistribute them properly, which may lead to unexpected deaths of enemies protected by Axel's redistribution shield. Axel is the single most used field pet in the entire game, being the most viable pet on defense and still having high use rate on offense, so this advantage is nothing to scoff at. Last but not least, Nexters added Oliver and Mara patronage options to Ishmael in addition to his previous Soul Fenris patronage option. While Fenris remains to be the consistently most useful pet on Ishmael, Oliver is a very useful alternative, as sometimes Ishmael needs more durability to sweep a team rather than simple raw damage. Oliver patronage is particularly useful against teams that use either Corvus, Rufus or Aurora as their tanks, or if they don't have any tanks at all, as it's usually only the tanks that can even pose a defensive threat to Ishmael. As far as Mara goes, she is the least useful patronage option, because her stats don't do too much for Ishmael, But if you need Ishmael's troll stuns from his violet skill to last up to 3 seconds rather than the usual 1 second, you have that option. Now it's time to finally address the elephant in the room. Is Ishmael great again with all of these changes? And if so, how great are we talking? To answer that question, I have personally asked the most illustrious, yet also the most enigmatic influencer in the Hero Wars sphere, James Madnell from Hero Wars Haven. Here's what he had to say.
Corvus can tank Ishmael. Corvus can tank Ishmael. Corvus can tank Ishmael. Corvus can tank Ishmael.
Thank you for your very valuable input, James. Jokes aside, Ishmael is now seriously good enough to perform his original function in battles. Once again, he is a dangerous enemy to approach in Guild Wars when he's charged up. It also helps on some level that one of his former obstacles, Lilith, had been reworked on the 19th of January in 2022 to become a mage instead of a tank. Although I don't think the original Lilith would be a problem for the new Ishmael, the current Lilith is definitely not a problem. There is a very important caveat, though. As mentioned before, Ishmael becomes out of this world strong only when he is fully ascended, as that's where most of his relevant power comes from. Without ascension upgrades, Ishmael is still a bit mid in the endgame due to having less damage and more counters. On the flip side, Ishmael is very easy to pick up for new players, because at the end of the day, he is extremely potent and efficient in PvE, as he essentially combines the roles of a damage dealer, tank and a healer together. With the power creep and stat inflation, Ishmael is also very capable against Vajra, who he previously struggled against at higher levels, although he will probably still need a little bit of a nudge from Qingmao to do real damage. His chapter 14 and 15 performance is still a bit questionable due to sentry golems and due to Seymour being a ranged boss, but aside from that, he fares better there than before too. As far as PvP performance goes, the biggest thing you'll obviously notice is that he absolutely doesn't have problems with damage anymore. In fact, he can one-shot Zeri with Aiden's binding skill with the help of his dependable allies. If the Queen of Physical Durability can't survive Ishmael, then nobody can. His survivability is also quite high, due to vampirism, elusive phantom and now with the inclusion of Oliver as well. It can take quite an effort to take him down now. What hasn't really changed about Ishmael, though, is the fact that his fighting style is still very linear. All he does is he stands there and smacks the enemy in the face. He doesn't do anything really exciting like throwing the enemies in the air, inflicting serious debuffs, controlling them to death or anything. This can obviously be exploited by the enemy team if their tank can survive long enough. For one, elusive phantom only lets Ishmael dodge physical and magic hits. It has absolutely no effect on pure damage, so pure damage dealers like Heidi or Iris can go to town on Ishmael at whatever time, albeit the vampirism recovery is still difficult to deal with. You could theoretically try to one-shot Ishmael with a pure damage team using Albus as a field pet, but I wouldn't rely on it too strongly. Another very exploitable weakness are control effects. Ishmael absolutely can't deal with control effects, and one strong debuff could instantly end his attack. Even something minor like silence can spell doom for Ishmael, as it blocks the activation of his green and ultimate skills for its duration, creating a vulnerability to physical and magic attacks. Usually Ishmael is the only hero capable of dealing damage in modern Ishmael teams, so if Ishmael dies, it will result in an auto win, unless it's a defense team and the rest of his team stalls you somehow. Dodge can also limit the advance of Ishmael's army, but, admittedly, in a confrontation with Dodge, it can go either way. All Ishmael needs is one hit to kill Dodge heroes, and if he can do that, he will win the confrontation. Ishmael has a notably good matchup against Yasmin, because Yasmin can't hurt Ishmael in any capacity when his phantom skill is active, as Yasmin requires physical hits to connect to stack her pure damage, and her paralysis debuff is too short to really stop Ishmael. Unless Yasmin gets lucky, Ishmael will roll her. Ishmael also remains to be somewhat lackluster against enemies that can summon minions, as they can slow Ishmael's advance down, but it's important that those minions stay in the front line so they can effectively hold Ishmael. If they're way in the back, you're just patting yourself on the back for a good effort, and you've likely mistaken Ishmael for Jew. Despite Ishmael's serious rework, he still has several notable counter-heroes. These are: Number 1. Amira. She is a fairly recent rising star, and still underappreciated by many. Amira's green skill, Desperate Fury, is a simultaneous buff and debuff skill. It increases the critical hit rate of the enemy agility heroes wielding the critical hit stat, and makes their critical hits completely miss for the duration of this skill. It has a duration of 7 seconds and a base timeout of 14 seconds, with an initial base timeout of 8 seconds. This skill completely negates Ishmael's massive damage output and makes him a non-threat. It has a very high uptime and completely bypasses debuff protections in PvP, making it a very reliable method of stopping Ishmael. Number 2. Astrid and Lucas. For the reasons listed earlier in the video, modern Ishmael teams tend to not utilize heroes with combined hit capabilities or damage over time debuffs that would break Lucas easily, so she can be used to stop Ishmael from massacring her team. Unfortunately, because she is so limited, not many can afford or are willing to use her. Number 3. Phobos. His paralysis ultimate skill, combined with Bound by Fear violet skill, makes for a useful stopgap measure against Ishmael, as his ultimate skill lasts for 6.6 seconds and bypasses all PvP debuff protections and immunities, while Ishmael's elusive phantom lasts for 6 seconds. Unless Phobos hits Ishmael at a very inconvenient time, he will easily outlast Ishmael's green skill and weigh him down and burn his energy while preventing any action from Ishmael. With good timing, Phobos can kill Ishmael entirely on his own without the help of his team. As Ishmael teams don't generally use Isaac, Phobos remains to be a useful counter-hero against Ishmael. There are, of course, other heroes who can fight Ishmael better than the others, but I believe there is no reason to name all of them. They're not that hard to notice. Last thing before this video ends, I have 2 clips comparing Ishmael's performance before his rework and after his rework. First, let's see his pre-rework performance. Now let's see his post-rework performance. Quite the substantial improvement there. Ishmael's future is bright once more, and we can only hope it stays that way. I don't think anyone wants to relive the period of picking up a new main in 2019 while having a developed useless hero. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in another YouTube video.